So welcome back. So today we're going to go over depth of field. So what is depth of field and how do we control that in our camera? I have to say this is probably to me the most important aspect of photography is controlling that depth of field and how my image looks. There's three different factors that control depth of field. Number one is aperture. Inside the lens, you have an iris and it is read in f-stops, and that aperture controls your depth of field. The second one, distance to subject. So how far you are away from a subject. So if you're far away from a subject, you're going to have a wide depth of field, and if you're close, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. The last one is focal length. Now focal length is the millimeter of your lens, or if you have a wide focal length or a wide angle lens, you're going to have a wide depth of field. If you have a long focal length, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. We have to determine or understand what the field actually is before we can kind of go into how we control it. So what's the field? So if we have this center line in this tree and we assume that this is the focus point of our camera, so when we are taking a picture, we're focusing on that tree right here. Well, there's an area before and behind the image that's in focus. This is the depth of field. This is the field, this is the depth of that field. So if it's in closer, we have a shallow depth of field, and if it's out wide, we have a large or a wide depth of field. So the field is this distance that we see as in focus in an image before and after it. So let's go on to aperture. So what is aperture? So aperture is inside your lens, and there's a diaphragm or an iris, and it opens and closes when you take a picture. So when it's wide open, it will look like this, and as it closes down, it gets smaller and smaller. Now the number is read in what's called an f-stop. So there's 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, and 11. These are whole f-stops going from letting the most light in to the least amount of light in. It's sometimes confusing because 2.8, which is the smallest, you would think would be the smallest opening. Well, it's not. It's the largest in f11, and the higher the number, the smaller the opening. So how does this work? When your lens is wide open, it's letting in a lot of light, and when it's closed down, it's letting in less light. However, when it's wide open, you have a shallow depth of field, meaning the field is going to be just a little bit in front of and a little bit behind in focus. When you are down at a high number on the f-stop scale, you're going to have a wide depth of field, meaning a lot is going to be in focus in front of and behind your subject. The next method is distance to subject. So we can see we have this person and they are far away from the tree. If you are far away from the tree, you're going to have a wider depth of field. So as you get farther and farther away, you're going to have a greater depth of field or a wide depth of field. As you get close to a subject, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. The last method is focal length. So focal length is the distance your lens is from your sensor or your camera. So if your lens is close, you're going to have a wide focal length, and if it's far away, you're going to have a long focal length. And this is written in millimeters up here. So a 35 millimeter is an example of a wide focal length or a wide angle lens. 300 millimeters is an example of a long focal length. And a long focal length is going to have a shallow depth of field. Alright, aperture. So how this work is, in this case, we're going to keep the camera where it is on both. We're going to keep the lens where it is and the subject where it is. The only thing that we're going to change is the size of the opening of the aperture. So this is a small opening and this is a large opening. And what's going to determine depth of field is how fast the light rays spread apart. So you can see the light rays in this case are spreading apart really slowly. But in this one, they're spreading apart much faster. So when your light rays don't spread apart as fast, you're going to have a wider depth of field or more in focus. As your light rays spread apart faster, you're going to have a shallower depth of field and less in focus. So right here, what we've changed is this opening. When you have a small opening, your light rays are spreading apart much slower, so you're going to have this wider depth of field. With a large aperture, your light rays are spreading apart much faster, so you're going to have a shallower depth of field. So let's go to distance to subject. So in this case, we're keeping the camera and the lens the same distance from each other, but in this case, we're moving the camera back farther away and this one closer to the subject. So when the camera is far away from the subject, you will notice that your light rays are spreading apart much slower. So we're going to have a wide depth of field. As we move closer to the subject, the camera and the lens are the same distance. The light rays are spreading apart faster. So in this case, we're having a shallower depth of field. So a wide depth of field, you're going to move farther away from your subject. A shallower depth of field, you're going to move closer to your subject. The last case is focal length. So in this case, we're leaving the camera where it is, but we're moving the lens closer to the camera. So when you move the lens or closer to the camera, you have a wide angle lens or a wide focal length. When you do that, you have a wider depth of field. Well, why? Because right here, the light rays are spreading apart much slower than when you have a long focal length. They're spreading apart much quicker. So if you have a longer lens, it's going to be closer to the subject. And in this case, the light rays are going to spread apart much faster. So when you have a wide angle lens, you have a wider depth of field because your light rays are spreading apart much slower. And when you have a long focal length, they spread apart quicker, and you're going to have a shallower depth of field. Now, I think this is like one of the key elements. You'll see a lot of times when people shoot portraits, they have a long focal length lens. Well, why? Because they want to blur that background out. And usually people are shooting with a wide lens when they want to shoot a landscape or get everything in focus. So I think the key elements when really working with depth of field, you're going to be really controlling your focal length. You're going to be shooting with a specific lens because it's going to tend to lend itself better to having either a wide depth of field or a shallow depth of field. Or you're going to come here to aperture because you're not really moving or changing the way the image looks. You're just changing the opening size of the aperture, and that's going to allow you to get either a wider depth of field or a shallower depth of field. So I really tend to use focal length and aperture to really control my depth of field or distance to subject in certain situations. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any more comments or questions on depth of field, you can leave those questions below, and don't forget to subscribe.